As we learned in class this week, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So we're going to learn about graphing in STATA within this module. Specifically, we're going to look at how to make a box plot, a histogram, and a scatter plot. And then we're going to look at some things in STATA that allow us to make our graphs really pretty in practice. So the first thing you're going to want to do is open up the Framingham dataset in STATA. Anytime you want to make a graph in STATA, it's typically done through the graphics menu. The first graph I want to look at is a box plot of systolic blood pressure at baseline or at exam 1 for our study participants. So I go graphics and I go down to box plot. In the variables window, I enter the variable that I'm interested in, specifically systolic blood pressure at exam 1, and then I hit submit. A box plot then appears that contains information about the distribution of systolic blood pressure at exam 1. On the y-axis, STATA puts the variable label for systolic blood pressure there so you know exactly what you're looking at. Examining this box plot, as we did in class this week, you can see that it looks like it's a relatively skewed distribution. You see the long tail out here. Now close your box plot and let's look at how to make a histogram of systolic blood pressure at exam 1. I just go graphics, histogram, and then I put the variable that I'm interested in the variable window, systolic blood pressure at exam 1, and hit submit. Again, I see the variable label for systolic blood pressure, and I see that systolic blood pressure does have this long right tail, suggesting that the distribution of systolic blood pressure is skewed. Now, looking at the window for histograms within STATA, you see that there's a bunch of different options that I can explore for my histogram. One that I specifically want to look at this lab is the number of bins. So if I move this window and I go over and I look at the command that was actually run in STATA, it says histogram systolic blood pressure 1. And then I see right here that it tells me that in that previous histogram that we looked at, there were 36 bins. Now let's say I wanted to explore using a different number of bins. Then I go down here, I click on number of bins, let's set it to 10 and hit submit. So now you see that I get a much less coarse view of what's going on. It's making much bigger bins, grouping more people together into these systolic blood pressure bins. On the other hand, let's say I change the bin number to more than 36. Let's say I went up to 60 bins and I hit submit. Now I get a very coarse picture of what's going on, and I even probably get a better idea of what the general shape of this distribution looks like. So the more bins you use, the fewer people per bin, but you're going to get a much coarser, in-depth look at what the distribution of systolic blood pressure looks like. So thus far, I've only looked at histograms and box plots for the entire population. Now let's break up the histograms into groups, say groups specified by male versus female. So within the histogram window, I'm going to go all the way over to the right, click on the By tab, and I'm going to say Draw Subgraphs for unique values of variables and type in sex1. Hit submit. Now I get two different histograms. I get one histogram for males, one histogram for females, and then I can compare the shape of these distributions for males versus females to get an idea of what the differences are between males and females when it comes to blood pressure. I could do a very similar thing for box plots, going to box plot, move over to the By column and say Draw Subgraphs, again for sex at exam 1. Now I get side-by-side box plots for males and females. You can see that the distribution for females actually looks a little bit more skewed than for males. The interquartile range is larger, suggesting that there might be more variability in systolic blood pressure for females at exam 1. The last type of graph that we're going to look at is the scatter plot. So in the graphics menu, this is the first option. We go graphics, two-way graph. Now I'm going to make a graph of systolic blood pressure at exam 1 versus exam 2. So within the two-way graph window, I hit create. I just want this basic plot, the first option, a scatter plot. My y variable is going to be systolic blood pressure at exam 2. X variable, same thing at exam 1. And I hit accept. So now you see that I have one plot that's now appeared within this plot definitions window. If I hit submit, STATA goes ahead and it makes this scatter plot for me. And I see that it does appear that there's a positive association between systolic blood pressure at exam 1 versus exam 2. All right, so we've seen the general tour of how to make graphs within STATA. The next thing that we're going to do is to learn how to make these graphs pretty, make these publication quality graphs. Okay, so to do that, we can go File. Within the graph window, you go File, Start Graph Editor. Now this graph editor tool in STATA, it's really neat. So you can basically change anything that you see on your plot and make it look exactly like you want it to look. One of the most basic things that we might want a title. So I go Object Browser, double click on Title. We'll call this My First Scatter Plot. Hit OK. And now you see that our title appears at the top of the scatter plot. There's so many other things you can do. You can change the ticks on the y-axis. You can change the ticks on the x-axis. I could change the color scheme. I could add text to my plot. So really, this graph editor allows you to make your graphs look exactly like you want them to look. Now the next thing we're going to learn about in STATA is how to save your graph. So within this graph window, I can go File, Save, and I could give my graph a name, like My First Scatter Plot. Now the important thing to see is down here it says Save As Type, and we want to save it as a STATA graph. It's this .gph extension. So anytime you make a graph in STATA and you are going to put this in, say, a publication or a report, etc., make sure you save one copy of your graph as a .gph file. Because what that does is, if later on you've decided that you used the wrong font, or you didn't make the font big enough, or you need to change some subtle thing on your graph, if you've saved your graph as a .gph file, you can always go back later and edit that graph. You can edit any of the features of the graph. So make sure you save one copy as a .gph file. Additionally, for your publication, you might want to save it as a PNG file. You could save it as an EPS file, as a PDF. STATA allows you to save your graphs in many, many, many different formats. So you pick whichever your favorite format is, but make sure you save one copy as a STATA graph file. So once you're done editing your graph, you go File, Stop Graph Editor. Do I want to save the changes to my graph? Sure. Save. All right, so I've got my scatter plot that I created. If I didn't want to save this as a JPEG or a PDF file, I could also just right-click on the actual scatter plot that I've made, and I could say Copy, and then I could paste that graph into a Microsoft Word document or some text editor that I've been using. So this is the basics of constructing plots and graphs in STATA, as well as learning how to make those graphs pretty. So I strongly suggest that in your own time you go through this graph editor and you learn about the different options if you're interested in making publication quality graphs.